the Rock and Roll Unraveled Show. I'm Derek Shelmadine. Welcome to another Rock and Roll Unraveled show. Now we're going to take a journey through the 1960s, arguably the most formative decade in rock and roll history. Now on this Odyssey, we're going to look at how the music matured and diversified as it moved from the 1950s into the 1970s. It started out with the beat groups as they morphed from skiffle groups, and by the end of the 1960s, rock had developed into, well, rock music, prog rock, folk rock, psychedelic, country rock, stadium rock, and the birth of glam, metal, space, and jazz rock. The 1960s started with a top 20 on the 1st of January 1960, and the number one single was Emil Ford and the Checkmates, What Do You Want to Make Those Eyes at Me For? Now, with lots of the links to the 1950s in that first 1960 chart, at number 2 was Adam Faith with What Do You Want? And he was in a skiffle group called the Worried Men, and he was actually discovered as a solo singer playing with the Worried Men at the Two Eyes. The Two Eyes was a coffee bar in London's Soho district. It played live music and was very much the spiritual home of skiffle. At number 5 was Cliff Richard and the Shadows with Travelling Lights. He also played the Two Eyes and met most of the Shadows there. And number 10, Tommy Steele with Little White Bull. Now he was Britain's first rock and roll hero, but now he was a film star and very much a family entertainer. In early 1960, there were a couple of other links to the 1950s. On the 3rd of March, Elvis stepped off in Scotland. His army career was over, and it's officially the only time he set foot on British soil. And sadly, on the 17th of April, Eddie Cochran died at the age of 21 in a car crash, and that was at the end of his UK tour. He was headed back to the airport to go home. I mentioned that beat groups morphed very much from UK rock and roll and skiffle groups, and the difference was that with beat groups, the focus was on the whole group, not just on the singer. And one of the landmarks was the 25th of May, when the Cavern in Liverpool held its first beat night. And that featured Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, and that was with Ringo Starr. He joined the Beatles from Rory Storm, and also Johnny Guitar, very much a local Liverpool hero. And it also featured Cass and the Casanovas, another great band. The entry fee was 2 and 6, and that's 12.5 of your new English pennies. In the July, Tony Sheridan and his band the Jets led the way to Hamburg. That was actually a training ground for many of the up-and-coming beat groups. They played in the red light district of Hamburg, and many other groups followed over the next 2 or 3 years. And of course, Mersey Beat emerged in Liverpool, and one of the great early Mersey Beat bands was Howie Casey and the Seniors. And for our first song, this is Howie Casey and the Seniors with Twist of the Top. In the summer of 1961, there was a Poetry at the Mermaid Festival at the Mermaid Theatre in London. And 17-year-old Jimmy Page accompanied beat poet Royston Ellis. Jimmy Page, of course, found fame later with the Yardbirds and, of course, Led Zeppelin. And that was a fusion of music and poetry. Ellis saw Page perform with Neil Christian and the Crusaders and invited him to appear at the Poetry Festival to play guitar for him. Now, Ellis was an accomplished beat poet and writer, and he often gave poetry readings around this time, regularly accompanied by musicians. And these included Cliff Richard's backing group, The Shadows, and even a pre-Hamburg Beatles, well, in the form of John Lennon and Stuart Sutcliffe. They accompanied him at the Jacaranda Club in the June of 1960 in a band called The Dissenters. Now, over in America, Motown was establishing itself as a major soul label. Protest singers were emerging, and the new surf music caught the rock and roll waves. Well, it was the August of '61 when the Marvelettes released their debut single, Please Mr. Postman, and that was the first American number 1 for Motown. Interestingly enough, Marvin Gaye was the drummer on that particular platter. Berry Gordy launched his first record label, Tamla, in the January of 1959, and that was with the aid of an $800 loan. And the following December, he formed Motown Company and label in Detroit, Michigan, and the recording studios are aptly named Hitsville, USA. Well, the British releases were originally licensed on labels like Stateside and London American, and it wasn't until 1965 that Berry Gordy actually combined those two label names to form Tamla Motown. And the first release on that label was The Supremes with Stop in the Name of Love. Bob Dylan appeared on the scene in the March of 1962 with his first album, Bob Dylan. Now that came about after he'd been playing harmonica at a recording session for a Caroline Hester album, and the producer John Hammond was so impressed with Bob Dylan that he signed him to Columbia shortly afterwards. Although the album sales were a little disappointing at first, and Dylan's signing to the label became known as Hammond's Folly. Well, in the summer of '62, the Beach Boys released their first single on Capitol, Surfing Safari, and around the same time Elvis released his album Pot Luck, and that was his last album of new rock material for 7 years. Because of course across the 1960s Elvis was focusing his attention on becoming a movie star. Back in the UK in the March, Alexis Corner's Blues Incorporated played a gig at the Ealing Rhythm and Blues Club in West London, and for that gig they were billed as Britain's first rhythm and blues band. And the 12th of July 1962 was a red letter day in the Rolling Stones calendar. It was their first gig as the Rolling Stones, and that was at London's Marquee Club. Now, in mid-62, Brian Jones had formed his own band. The first lineup moved on, and that's when Mick Jagger and Keith Richards joined. And the lineup for that historic performance at the Marquee was Mick, Keith and Brian, with pianist Ian Stewart, Dick Taylor on bass. He went on to form the Pretty Things. But there are various accounts of who occupied the drumming stool. Well, the band took their name from the Muddy Waters song Rolling Stone. And in the August, the Tornadoes released Telstar in the UK, and when that was released in America, it became the first American #1 by a British group, produced by the legendary independent producer Joe Meek. And it was October of '62 when the Beatles released their first single, Love Me Do. Now they came together, well, it all started really in the July of 1957, when on the 6th, John met Paul at Woolton Fete. George joined the Quarrymen, as they were then, the following February. It was the 17th of August 1960 when they made their first Hamburg trip. The lineup for that was John, George and Paul on guitar, bassist Stu Sutcliffe and drummer Pete Best. He'd only joined just before this Hamburg trip, and they'd also just changed their name. They had been the Silver Beatles, they dropped the silver, and for the first time, when they embarked on this Hamburg trip, they were simply the Beatles. That single, Love Me Do, well, that was released on the 5th of October 1962, and that gave them their first UK hit, made number 17. I mentioned Alexis Corner's Blues Incorporated earlier, and they were billed as Britain's first rhythm and blues band. Well, you don't hear an awful lot of Alexis Corner on the radio, not half enough, and this is Alexis Corner's Blues Incorporated with the blues classic, I Got My Mojo Working. You're listening to Derek Shelmerdine with a Rock and Roll Unraveled show. We're taking a journey through the music of the 1960s. But before continuing with the story, there's an opportunity to win a signed copy of my book, Rock and Roll Unraveled. Just check out the link on my homepage, rockandrollunraveled.com, answer a simple question, and you're in the draw for a signed copy. Now, Rock and Roll Unraveled tells a story of rock and roll from its roots to mid-1970s punk, and Record Collector Magazine's review described the book as comprehensive and invaluable. Well, good luck with the competition, but meanwhile, back at the plot. Well, the Beatles released their first American single on the 25th of February 1963 on the small independent VJ label. Now, Capitol Records, the sister company of Parlophone, they were released on in the UK, wasn't interested in picking up the Beatles. They didn't see any mileage in them. So their early singles were all released in America on small independent labels. That's VJ, Tolly and Swan. And it wasn't until the January of 65 that Capitol decided there might be some mileage in the Beatles, and they released I Wanna Hold Your Hand. It gave them their first American hit. In fact, it was at number 1 for 7 weeks. Now, Please Please Me was also their second UK single, and that became a number 2, so they still hadn't had a national number 1. Our beat and R&B groups are definitely picking up a head of steam, and in June the Rolling Stones released their debut single, Come On, and Jerry and the Pacemakers were the first beat group to have a British number 1, and actually the first group or artist to have their first 3 singles enter the UK charts at number 1. They started off in the March with How Do You Do It, the May, I Like It, and followed those up on the October with You'll Never Walk Alone, and that was written by Rodgers and Hammerstein and originally from the 1945 musical Carousel. August 63 saw the debut of the wonderful TV show Ready Steady Go, and the first theme music there was the Safaris' Wipeout. And the 1st of June 64, another Red Letter Day, this time on TV, and it was the debut of Top of the Pops. But it was the 9th of February 1964 when the Beatles made their first appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show, and it marked the beginning of the British invasion. And for the next couple of years, British groups absolutely dominated the American charts. But the first tour by British Invasion group wasn't from the Beatles. It was in the May when Dave Clark 5 arrived on the beaches in America. And March 64 is also an interesting time because that was when pirate radio arrived. Radio Caroline made its first radio broadcast, and the pirate radio ships and forts played non-stop pop music. And that was because the BBC had the monopoly on radio in the UK, and they very rarely condescended to play any pop music, so there was very little to be heard. The only pop music in the UK came from Radio Luxembourg 208, but their signal very famously faded in and out. Now, Teddy Boys had been a subculture of the 1950s rock and roll, and the Mods emerged as one of the earliest 1960s teen subcultures. And they loved bands like The Who, Small Faces, The Kinks, The Action. Now, the mod bands were very much a link between the beat groups of the early 1960s and the rock bands of the mid-1960s. And it was the Easter weekend of 1964 that Mods and Rockers chose Margate to battle it out for the first time. Now, Mods were sharply dressed, rode scooters, liked soul music, as well as bands like The Who and the Small Faces. They also liked to pop pills. Rockers wore leather, rode motorcycles, and liked white American rock and roll. People like Gene Vincent and Eddie Cochran. And for the next couple of years, Mods and Rockers would clash at various coastal holiday resorts, most bank holiday weekends. Well, it was the July that the High Numbers released their only singles, Zoot Suit and I'm the Face, and that was promoted as the first mod record. The High Numbers, well, shortly after this single, they renamed Back to the Who. But for our next piece of music, I thought we'd hear from a slightly less well-known mod band, and this is The Creation, Making Time. Motown was a big influence on the Mods, and in the July of 64, the Four Tops released Baby I Need Your Lovin' in America, and that was their debut on Motown. But it wasn't until mid-65 that they had their first UK hit with I Can't Help Myself. Tamla Motown was a very big part of the soul sounds of the 1960s, with people like The Temptations, Stevie Wonder, Martha and the Vandellas. The Who were generally considered to have the first rock opera, and that was Tommy in 1969. But Frank Zappa was well ahead of the game with his I Was a Teenage Malt Shop. That was very nearly the first ever rock opera, but sadly, a branch of CBS television turned that down at the end of 1964. But talking of The Who, they released their first single as The Who on the 15th of January 65, and that was I Can't Explain. In the July, Bob Dylan played the Newport Folk Festival, and that was where he played his first electric set, and he took to the stage for this infamous performance with most of the Paul Butterfield's blues band. Now, new bands were emerging in America on both the East and West Coasts. On the West Coast, you had people like Jefferson Airplane and Country Joe and the Fish, and in New York, Velvet Underground were playing their first gig. They were very much prodigies of Andy Warhol, pop artist, and they were part of his multimedia, Exploding Plastic Inevitable. What a great name. The Beatles are making history again. In the August, they played Shea Stadium, and that was the first stadium gig for a rock and roll band. Psychedelia's on the horizon. In the November, Ken Casey and his Merry Pranksters organised the first of their public LSD-laced acid tests. And they were selling spiked orange juice called Electric Kool-Aid. Now, it's often referred to that event as the birth of psychedelic rock, and the Warlocks played at this particular acid test just before changing their name to the Grateful Dead, and they actually became regular performance at other Ken Casey organised acid tests. And if you recognise Ken Casey, that's because he's the guy who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. But from Motown, the Hitsville, USA studios, this is the Four Tops, and Baby I Need Your Loving. By the time 1966 rolled in, we were very much at the tail end of the beat group era. 3 Birmingham beat groups combined: Carl Wayne, Chris Ace the Face Kefford and Bev Bevan from Carl Wayne and the Vikings, Roy Wood from Mike Sheridan's Lot, and Trevor Burton from Danny King and the Mayfair Set. Well, they got together and formed the Move. It wasn't all new things coming in, though. Old things were still fading away. And in the March, Phil Spector was recording River Deep, Mountain High, and this turned out to herald the end of his Wall of Sound era. It was Ike and Tina Turner, and they were intended to be Phil Spector's next big thing. The Righteous Brothers had moved on. And despite making number 3 in Britain, it just managed to crawl to number 88 on the American charts, and it completely disheartened Phil Spector. He cut a handful more of his Wall of Sound on the Phillies label, and that was it. That was goodbye Wall of Sound. And the Beatles gave their last ever concert in the August at San Francisco's Candlewick Park. Well, rock music was very much on the horizon now. On the 31st of July, Cream gave their first official gig. And shortly afterwards, Jimi Hendrix joined them on stage and jammed with Cream. This was shortly after he'd arrived in London, and the Pink Floyd had started gigging. It's interesting, a number of different things are coming to a natural end as rock music is coming very much to the fore. It was the final edition of Ready Steady Go on the 23rd of December 66, and that was very much the end of beat, mod, R&B type beat groups. But many of these musicians actually went on to great things. Jimmy Page, of course, went from the Yardbirds to Led Zeppelin. Mark Bolan, Rod Stewart and David Bowie had all been slogging away throughout the 1960s, but they didn't find fame until the 1970s. The beat and mod groups who did survive tended to be the ones that wrote their own material: the Beatles, Stones, Who, Kinks, Coming to the Summer of Love. And you could say that started on the 14th of January 1967 with an event that called itself Powwow, a gathering of the tribes for a human being. And that was at Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. And that very much set the scene for San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district to become the centre of the hippie universe. The event was inspired by a new law banning the psychedelic drug LSD, and the event brought the beat generation and the hippie culture together. The sort of poets and speakers included Allen Ginsberg, well-known beat poet, Timothy Leary, LSD guru, and anybody from that era will remember his mantra: turn on, tune in, drop out. And Jerry Rubin, a well-known counterculture figure, he was very much an opponent of the Vietnam War. And the rock bands included Grateful Dead, Quicksilver Messenger Service and Jefferson Airplane. And in the May, Jimi Hendrix Experience released their debut album, Are You Experienced? And he really was one of the pioneers of rock music. And from that debut album, this is the Jimi Hendrix Experience, Love or Confusion. You're listening to Derek Shelmerdine and the Rock and Roll Unraveled show. Now we're taking an odyssey through the 1960s. And lots of bands and artists mentioned in the show have tour dates in the diary. And to see the latest tour information, check out my website, rockandrollandravel.com. And at the top, you can see 1960s, 70s artists touring now. That'll tell you who's where, when. Well, back to the story. On the 12th of May 1967, Procol Harum released one of the anthems of the Summer of Love, A Whiter Shade of Pale. And on the 1st of June, the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And that's still topping the best album of all time, half a century later. Well, on the 10th of June, there was the Fantasy Fair and Magic Mountain Music Festival in San Francisco. And that's often considered to be the first rock festival, although you probably haven't heard of it, because a week later, the one everybody remembers, and one of the most significant events in festival history, was the first Monterey International Pop Festival at Monterey County Fairgrounds in California. Famously, The Who and Jimi Hendrix appeared on the third day, and neither wanted to follow the other on stage. Both had seen the other's stage act, but a toss of the coin put The Who on first. But it wasn't all bad news for Jimi Hendrix. For their American debut, this actually led to their invitation to support the Monkees on their American tour. The 6th of October saw the death of Hippie March in Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, and that was to mourn the passing of the real thing. Sadly, the hippie values have been hijacked by big business and hip record executives. And November saw the first issue of Rolling Stone magazine. Well, a landmark day for British radio was the 30th of September, when Radio 1 made its first broadcast, and that was the first official rock and pop radio station in the UK. In early January 68, Steppenwolf released Born to be Wild, and that was when the term heavy metal was coined in that particular song. And also, Bill Graham opened the Fillmore East in New York, and along with his Fillmore West were two of the most famous US concert venues. Oh, I love it. On the 26th of June, Nice were banned for life from the Royal Albert Hall in London. What they'd done was given a flag-burning performance of America. And Keith Emerson has described this as the first instrumental protest song. Keith Emerson, the keyboards guy, of course, went on to Emerson, Lake and Palmer. And there were new faces popping up in the summer of 1968. We saw Yes, Led Zeppelin and Canadian band Rush for the first time. And there were also some new beginnings. David Gilmour replaced Syd Barrett in Pink Floyd, and John Lennon released his first solo album, Unfinished Music No. 1, Two Virgins. And great news for Elvis fans, he was back. The movie still continued for another year, but he was on the TV on the 3rd of December in his famous comeback special TV show, and Elvis and Black Leather were reunited. And sadly, it was Cream's farewell performance in the November. And there was a glimpse of what was to come. In the May, Ambrose Slade released their only single, Genesis. And of course, they were managed by Chas Chandler. And it was Chas Chandler who suggested they drop the name Ambrose. And of course, as Slade in the 1970s, they were really rather successful. A couple of classic albums in the summer of '69. The Who released Tommy, generally considered to be the first rock opera, and Captain Beefheart released the not very accessible but highly rated Trout Mask Replica. And if you've never heard it, give it a try. It's different. Well, this section started with the Summer of Love, and very much the anthem for those hippie days was Scott McKenzie with San Francisco, and in brackets, be sure to wear flowers in your hair. By mid-1969, rock music had become far more sophisticated. Some might say overly sophisticated. On the 6th of July, Procol Harum performed with a full symphony orchestra and chorus. Pop rock, prog rock, stadium rock, well, that was well and truly with us. The antidote came in the mid-70s with punk and T-shirts emblazoned with slogans like "Never trust a hippie." David Bowie finally had a hit record in the September, Space Oddity. He was so nearly a one-hit wonder. It was 3 years before his next hit record, Starman, and that was when his sustained success came. There were more new faces in the summer. Crosby, Stills and Nash. Hawkwind played their first gig as Band X, and Space Rock was with us. And the 9th of September was the first time Freddie Mercury, Brian May and Roger Taylor performed together on stage. And Elvis's career started afresh. On the 31st of July, he played in Las Vegas, and this heralded Elvis's third career stage, the cabaret years. It's also around this time that he released Suspicious Minds, and that gave him his last American chart topper in his lifetime. But then in August 15th to 17th, we had the most famous festival of them all, Woodstock. That was billed as 3 days of peace and music, and held at Max Yasgur's dairy farm in upstate New York. Now, despite the rain, an estimated 500,000 people went to this. The artists' phenomenal bill included Janis Joplin, Country Joe and the Fish, Crosby, Stills and Nash, joined by Neil Young on stage, and Jimi Hendrix was there, and he was calling himself Gypsy Sun and Rainbows. All very 1960s. But new genres were emerging as well at the back end of 1969. Miles Davis released Witch's Brew, and that very much brought around jazz rock fusion. Fairport Convention were out and about promoting their latest album, Legion Leaf, and that's very much seen as one of the early markers for British folk rock. And Steve Peregrine took, well, he left Tyrannosaurus Rex and was replaced by Mickey Finn. And Mark Bolan was transitioning Tyrannosaurus Rex to become T-Rex, and British glam rock was born. And finally, Altamont, 6th of December 1969. It was a free concert and the final show on the Rolling Stones' 1969 US tour. And following the use of Hells Angels as security in the previous July at the free concert in London's Hyde Park, they were employed again. This time with disastrous results. Violence escalated throughout the day. Jefferson Airplane's Marty Balin was knocked out by one of the Angels. And during the Stones performance, Meredith Hunter, who was standing near the front of the stage, pulled out a gun. Well, one of the Hells Angels, a guy called Alan Passaro, tackled him and stabbed him to death. The incident was actually caught on the documentary film Gimme Shelter. Passaro was charged with murder but acquitted. Now, the bill comprised Santana, Jefferson Airplane, Flying Burrito Brothers, Crosby, Stills and Nash. Now, Grateful Dead were also due to play, but pulled out because of the escalating violence. And Altamont, often cited as the spiritual end of the 1960s. The end of the 1960s dream of optimism. Well, that's it. I've been Derek Shelmadine. You've been listening to the Rock and Roll Unraveled show on our journey through the music of the 1960s. I hope you've enjoyed listening to the show half as much as I've been putting the whole thing together. If you're into social media, I'm on Twitter at RNR Unraveled and Facebook at Rock and Roll Unraveled. Remember, you can win a copy of my book, Rock and Roll Unraveled. Just check out the website, rockandrollunraveled.com, and click on the link to the competition. Good luck with the competition. Join me again next time for another look, a little piece of rock and roll unraveled. Now, to play us out from the aptly named album they were on tour to promote, Let It Bleed, the track that was taken as the name of the Altamont documentary, this is the Rolling Stones' Gimme Shelter.